Who is the strongest man of all time? Actually, how do you even decide who's the strongest at all? There are many answers to this question, and if you went around the strength community, you would probably get more answers than you'd expect. Let's focus on what you could consider as the ultimate feat of strength. Picking as much weight as possible from the ground and putting it all the way over your head. Let's talk about the clean and jerk.
Oh, come on, Naeem. Unbelievable. Incredible.
Weightlifting is an old sport, so to start this out, we'll have to rewind quite a bit. Not quite there yet. A bit more. There we go. 1891, the birth of the sport of weightlifting. At this point in history, strongman shows were all the rage, where with the likes of Eugene Sandow, Charles Sampson, or Louis Uni gathering crowds to watch them perform different lifts. All of these guys were strong, really strong, but mainly they were showmen. It is impossible to know if the feats that they claimed were legit. In the late 19th century, Charles Sampson challenged any man to beat him in a lift-off for 500 pounds, which would be the equivalent of roughly 80,000 pounds in today's money. Sandow showed up with no warning, challenged Sampson, and beat him. This event might not have been exactly the birth of competitive weightlifting, but as far as public awareness goes, it was pretty much it. In the following years, more and more of these battles started to appear, but all of them had the exact same issue as the Sampson versus Sandow one: cheating. There were no set rules, set equipment, set movements, and it was all in the hands of the strongman. Uneven weights, fake weights, anything you can think of, it was there. And so, against the unequal, unregulated kind of Wild West of early strength sport, John Astley Cooper will set the foundation of what will become the first official strength sport in history. He will start off with a national competition with the goal of finding the strongest British lifter. And a few months later, the first international weightlifting competition was held. The first World Weightlifting Championships. The event had no weight classes and consisted of 8 movements, both single and double-handed, but we'll focus on one only, done with a barbell. In this portion of the competition, the competitors were required to lift 180 pounds, or approximately 80 kilos, to their shoulders, then overhead as many times as they could. Only 2 of the 8 men participating managed to press the weight overhead. So that's where we'll start. In the first ever World Championships, 2 men, Faun and François, managed to lift 180 pounds over their head. For the sake of this video, we'll call this the first official world record ever. Sure, it isn't representative of the maximum weight any man could put overhead in 1891, but it's official and it's convenient. In parts thanks to this event and to a few other ones that took place in the following years, weightlifting will be chosen as an official sport at the very first Olympic Games in 1896. But before we get there, let's take a quick stop in 1892. Louis Uni from France, aka Apollo, one of the most renowned strongmen in the world, comes up with a new device to bring to his shows: the Apollo's wheels. This was quite literally 2 train wheels attached to a thick bar. This bar will become somewhat legendary in the strength world. It was almost 2 inches thick, weighed 166 kilos, and was non-revolving. There is no record of him clean jerking this bar, but on the very same year, Apollo will do something special. In Lille, Uni clean jerked 155 kilos in front of an audience. No way to verify the weight though, and not made in competition, but still, the heaviest weight ever put overhead this far. So, back to 1896. The first Olympics are on, and weightlifting is a part of it. At this point, the sport is a part of the track and field events. It is held after all of the other events. 2 specific events are disputed. the one-hand event, basically a one-arm snatch, and the two-hand event that we will focus on. This is the earliest version of a clean and jerk to be implemented at the Olympics. The rules were slightly different though. Each athlete was allowed to gradually increase the weight, pretty similar to what we know, but the tiebreaker was actually fully aesthetic related. As the event came to end, Viggo Jansen and Elliot Launceston will both manage 111.5 kilos, but the judges will award the gold to Jansen as he lifted the weight with better form. I honestly wish I could tell you what was considered good form back then, but we really can't know. Either way, the British protested and managed to earn one more attempt for both the Danish and the British lifter. Both of them failed, and Jansen was the two-hand Olympic weightlifting champion and the new Olympic record holder. This is where we'll start to get actual numbers for the weights lifted. For the next few decades, no official world record will be registered, so we'll stick to Olympic records for now. Weightlifting will be skipped for the second edition of the Olympic Games. From the first Olympic of 1896 to 1904, multiple world championships will take place, with little to no records of the lifted weights surviving to our days. But in 1904, Olympic weightlifting was back. The Greek Pericles Kakousis will take the win in the two-hands event with 111.7 kilo, a minuscule improvement on the Olympic record set 8 years prior, but a record still. 2 years later, something that you might have never heard of happened: the intercalated game. Shortly after the start of the Olympic Games, a problem appeared. Bigger events in the same places were usually more attractive, and that kind of destroyed the attendance of the Olympics. The 1900 Games were overshadowed by the Exposition Universelle, and the ones of 1904 by the Louisiana Purchase Exposition. But Greece, having already organized the very first Olympics, had all the infrastructures ready to go. So they proposed something innovative. Every 4 years, in between every Olympics, Athens would host intercalated games. The idea was accepted, and the first games happened in 1906. Unsurprisingly, this was also the last edition of the event, but still. At the time, these were considered as official Olympic Games, and weightlifting was a part of it. These games were kind of crazy for our sport. Still, the one-hand and two-hands event were held, but the results were not even close to the games of 1904. The winner, Dimitrios Tofalos from Greece, lifted 142.5 kilos. This was 30 kilos over the Olympic record. But how? Well, it's complicated. As mentioned earlier, no official world records were registered in the early 1900s. To add on to that, the Olympics really weren't all that big and important, and the number of athletes traveling there was very, very small. Most athletes ended up just moving around to the weightlifting competitions close to them, meaning that some of the best weightlifters in the world were basically fully unknown. And so Tofalos was technically the world record holder before getting to the intercalated game, but this was the only chance he got to take part in there. Anyway, as I said, these games were then cancelled and weightlifting entered a pretty dark age. Multiple world championships took place after that, but they were for the most part local competitions where international athletes could participate rather than world championships. In 1908 and 1912, weightlifting was skipped at the Olympics, and with World War I starting in 1914, the sport was as unimportant as it could get. Before moving on to post-war weightlifting, I want to mention one specific world record that actually seemed to be recorded. In 1912, Hermann Gassler clean and jerked 151 kilos for world record. He was a wrestler turned weightlifter in the 1910s. This record is the only thing I could find out about him. So, after the war, sports in general took a little while to get back on track. But in 1920, the Olympics were back, and so was weightlifting. From there on, our sport will be a part of every single Olympic Games. For the first time, weight classes were introduced. It had been implemented at a few world championships over the 1910s, but we now had actual set weight classes. Along with that, the rules were getting more and more defined. Only 3 events were now competed: the one-arm snatch, the one-arm clean and jerk, and finally the 2-arms barbell clean and jerk. After almost 30 years of trial and error, weightlifting was finally starting to settle as a sport. Starting from this point in time, we'll only discuss the all-time world record clean and jerk. This video is already pretty long, as is, so I'll try to stick to the heaviest weight classes or to the heaviest lift. In 1920, no more medals per event. Pretty much as nowadays, the medals were awarded to the 3 best combined totals. These games will see the emergence of the earliest superpower country in weightlifting, France. The French will win 2 of the 5 possible gold medals and end up at the top of the leaderboard with 2 golds and a bronze. And, as you'd expect, the biggest lift of the competition was made by a Frenchman, Ernest Cadin. But he wasn't a heavyweight. He was actually competing in the 82.5 kilo class. He clean and jerked 135 kilos, quite a bit under the world record, but 15 kilos over any other lifter of the competition. This will be his very last international competition. But, without really knowing it, Cadin had set the ground for another French light heavyweight to change the sport for good, Charles Rigoulot. In 1924, the rules of weightlifting moved closer to what we have now. The one-arm snatch, the one-arm clean and jerk, the press, the snatch, and the clean and jerk. In this edition of the Olympics, an Estonian, Harald Tammer, will lift the heaviest bar, with a 140 kilo clean and jerk in the heavyweight class. But in the light heavyweight class, a new Frenchman, Charles Rigoulot, was competing internationally for the very first time. And he won. He managed 135 kilos, just like Cadin 4 years prior. But this really was just the beginning. At only 21 years old, Rigoulot was something special. In 1924, he will move up to the heavyweight class and break his first official clean and jerk world record, lifting 152.5 kilos. Within the next 6 months, he will then break the all-time world record 4 times and bring the weight of the heaviest barbell ever lifted overhead, all the way up to 161.5 kilos. In 1 year, Rigoulot had become an Olympic champion and added over 10 kilos to the heaviest clean and jerk ever. But he wasn't done. Now is the right time to bring up a very underground fact about the early days of Olympic weightlifting. Back in the early 1900s, athletes in the Olympics weren't professionals. They almost all had some kind of day job. But professional sports were a thing, especially in the world of strength. Nowadays, the most known sport with amateur and professional sections would be boxing, an Olympic title often representing a golden path to professional boxing, which is where the big money would be made. Well, back in the days, weightlifting was pretty much the same. Some of the best and most well-known weightlifters of the time would only compete in world and Olympic championships to build a reputation, then move on to the professional ranks, where big exhibitions were organized, bringing in crowds and big money. There weren't any professional weightlifting federations per se, but there were many professional weightlifters, all more or less known. This is the path that Charles Rigoulot took in 1925. From here on, we'll split the world record in 2. Professional and amateur. Thanks to his Olympic title and his all-time clean and jerk world record, the French had started to build up his name in the strength world. Shortly after his move to the professional ranks, one exhibition will skyrocket his career. Ernest Cadin, the 1920 Olympic champion, wasn't exactly happy with Rigoulot's rise to fame and challenged him to a face-off in Paris. This all-star weightlifting competition is a prime example of what weightlifting was in its early days. Both competitors agreed on a weightlifting style format, 10 attempts per lifters, 5 snatch and 5 clean and jerk. The athletes with the biggest total weight lifted takes the win. Rigoulot and Cadin were placed on a small platform at the center of an arena, lifting weights one after the other in the middle of a massive crowd. The competition will end with Rigoulot taking the title with 1,082 kilos lifted, some 5 kilo better than Cadin total. No world records were broken this day, but weightlifting was back and Europe couldn't be more excited about it. Rigoulot was now an actual celebrity and he was ready to capitalize on that. For the next 6 years, he will slowly chip at his world records and destroy the official records he set before turning pro. And in 1929, while no one had yet broken his 161 kilo official world record, Rigoulot will become the first man to clean and jerk over 400 pounds, with a 182.5 kilo clean jerk. This record, as all the ones of this era, was set on a non-revolving bar. As it wasn't set in an official IWF competition, the record will remain unofficial. This was an absurd weight to be lifted, and you might wonder if it was legit. But shortly after this lift, Rigolo will become the first man to officially lift the Apollo's wheel. And if he could lift 166 kilos of train wheels set on a 2 inches thick non-revolving bar, I think it's safe to say that 182.5 kilos on a normal bar isn't exactly unrealistic. This was the last record set by the Frenchman. Before moving on, I just want to know something about Charles' body weight. While he started out as an 82.5 kilo lifter, he went up quite a lot pretty fast. At his heaviest, in the heavyweight class, he weighed a little bit over 100 kilos or 220 pounds. That being said, back to the amateurs and to the official clean and jerk world records. As mentioned earlier, Rigolo record stood for a while. In 1928, the French light heavyweight dynasty is defeated. Louis Austin, newest prospect for the title, is defeated by the Egyptian Nosseir El Said, the new champ clean jerk to 142.5 kilos. Later on, he will take the heavyweight road, just like Rigolo before him, and 2 years after his title, he will break his very first heavyweight clean and jerk world record with 162.5 kilos, beating the 5-year-old French world record. And just like Rigolo, he'll go on and break the record again and again, bringing it all the way up to 167 kilos in the next year and a half. Weightlifting was now starting to settle as a sport, and men that could break the records were starting to get rare. The sport will have to wait 6 more years before finally seeing a new world record. In 1937, Arnold Luhar went on to give a shot at the record. Back in 28, he medaled at the same Olympics as El Said, but in the heavyweight class. And 9 years later, the Estonian was still there. At 32 years old, he had been competing since 1919. On this day, Arnold lifted 167.5 kilos and set the last world record before World War II. As to be expected, the wartime considerably slowed the record progress. Still, 2 records were broken during the war. Most notably, America finally managed to take a hold of the all-time world record, with Steve Stanko, future Mr. Universe, clean jerking 168 kilos in 1940. The record will then be pushed to 170.5 kilos by a new Egyptian lifter, Mohamed Geisa, in 1945. It had been 20 years since Rigolo's last official world record, and the amateur ranks weren't even halfway to his unofficial 400 pounds clean jerk. But after the World War, geopolitics will finally enter the sports fields. With the start of the Cold War and the buildup of tensions between the Western and Eastern blocs, sports, and most importantly Olympic sports, start to be considered as stand-ins for military competitions. And as massive budgets start to get injected within sport development programs, records are broken more and more often. Holding a world record is now a sign of power and dominance over any other countries. And what records could possibly be more important than the most weight ever lifted in competition settings? In this context, a new era begins. USA versus USSR. In 1946, Yakov Kutsenko becomes the first Soviet to hold the all-time clean jerk record. He lifts 171 kilos and takes the world record from the Egyptian. Within 9 months, he'll break the record 3 more times and bring it up to 174 kilos. There was a slight problem for the Soviets though. Yakov might have been the world record holder, but he wasn't the best weightlifter. In 1946, at Worlds, Yakov will get crushed by John Davis, new head of American weightlifting. Davis had first competed in 1938 at 17 years old, winning the World Championships. This was his second appearance on an international stage after he enlisted for the US Army during the war. And sure enough, after his win of 1946, Davis will go on to chip at the world record just a bit more and manage 174.5 kilos. There began the most dominating career in weightlifting this far. Davis will win the World Championships of 1946, 1947, the 1948 Olympics, the World Championships of 1949, 1950, and 1951, and the 1952 Olympics. And in 1951 at Nationals, the American became the first man to officially pass the 400 pounds mark in the clean and jerk. It took over 20 years to add 9 kilograms to Charles Rigouro's official world record, but only 6 years to add on 12 additional kilos. One interesting fact about Davis' run though. In 1948 he won the Olympics by quite a big margin, setting a 177.5 kilo clean jerk on the way. But the runner-up, another American, also gave a shot at the clean jerk all-time world record. His name was Norbert Chemansky. Norb was a pretty light heavyweight. In 1948, he competed in the plus 82.5 kilo class, while only weighing right around 92 kilos, 6 kilo less than Davis. But just after the 48 Olympics, a new class was created, the under 90 kilo weight class. And this is where he'll settle for a while. As Davis was improving the all-time world record, Norbert was busy in the 90 kilo class, pushing his limits as far as he could. And by 1953, with Davis' record still standing strong at 182 kilos, Chemansky managed a 177.5 kilo clean jerk at 90 kilos. Yeah, pretty mental. Around the same time, he probably realized that at this point, he was the strongest lifter in the world, and he might as well give a solid shot at the all-time world records. So he'll give it a shot and compete as a super heavyweight again. The all-time world record was 182 kilos. Chemansky clean jerk 187.5 kilos. The biggest improvement of all time on the clean jerk world record. This was a big deal. 24 years later, Rigouro's unofficial world record was finally broken. But it hadn't just been broken. Chemansky crushed it. He will then come back to the 90 kilo class briefly to add on to his record, clean jerking 181 kilos, then committing to the super heavyweight class. In the next 2 years, Chemansky will bring the record all the way up to 192.5 kilos. 10 more kilos added onto the all-time best clean jerk in 3 years. But sadly, Norbert's world record run will be cut short right before the 1956 Olympics. He'll injure his back and will never break another clean jerk world record. He will come back to competition though, and will even become the oldest man in the history of the sport to break a world record. But that's a story for another day. With Chemansky out of the picture, the US had to send another prospect for the super heavyweight Olympic title. And they had the perfect guy for the job. Paul Anderson. Paul was one of the biggest names in strength sport in the 50s. Strongman, weightlifter, powerlifter, there was almost nothing the man couldn't do. Mostly known for his press strength, he had traveled to the USSR for international competitions, beating the Soviets at their own game and becoming famed for his crazy feats of strength. And just a few months before the 1955 World Championships, he will set a new world record clean jerk, and a big one at that. He'll add on 4.5 kilos to Chemansky's record, managing a massive 196.5 kilo clean jerk. He will win the Olympics the following year, and it seemed like no one could even get close to him. Actually, on the year of the Olympics, he will clean and jerk 440 pounds, just shy of 200 kilos, at Nationals. But this wasn't an international competition, and on the contrary to previous ones, this record set at Nationals won't be registered. In the following years though, Anderson won't spend too much time competing internationally. He will take on a few different activities, more or less related to weightlifting. With Anderson not really trying to set any new world record and Chemansky out for injury, the Soviets finally had an opening. They needed someone to break the world record and bring it back to the USSR. And in 1959, Yuri Vlasov will be the one to stand up to the task. For the first time in 13 years, the all-time heaviest clean jerk record was back in the Soviet Union. And for almost all of its remaining history, it will stay there. Vlasov now had the record, and it was very, very close to the biggest milestone in weightlifting history, 200 kilos. With the Olympics coming, Vlasov had a chance to do something big, something special. But as you would expect, it wasn't going to be exactly easy. After a pretty long hiatus from major international competitions, Anderson was set to compete in the Rome Olympics, and he was ready. The American was rumored to have clean jerked right around 220 kilos in training, a massive excess of the world record he used to own. If he wanted to be the one coming out with the record, Vlasov would need to give it his all. Comes the Olympics though, something weird happened. Anderson, ready to compete, is denied his participation in the super heavyweight class. During the last few years, he had taken part in quite a few strength and weightlifting exhibition shows, but most importantly, in some professional wrestling shows. He had accepted money for his performance, and technically wasn't an amateur athlete anymore. As we mentioned when talking about Rigulo, weightlifting, as most sports of the time, used to have a solid distinction between amateur and professional athletes. The biggest impact of this split was seen in the Olympics. Until the early 21st century, the Olympic Games as a whole was solely an amateur event. Athletes were strictly forbidden to earn money from their sport, or even from any sport whatsoever. With the widespread state sponsorship appearing during the Cold War, the limit in between amateur and professional sport became thinner and thinner. But unluckily for Anderson, the amateur code was still enforced pretty seriously in the late 50s and early 60s. And so, just like this, the strongest man in the world would not be able to defend his Olympic title, and Vlasov had the Olympic win served on a platter. He'll crush the Americans and load a new world record clean jerk on his last attempt. But it wasn't 200 kilos. He wanted to break the barrier by more than that. He wanted to prove he was the best. So he loaded 202.5 kilos and made it. 100 kilo never was a hard bar to reach, no matter how far back you go, and 300 kilos will probably never be reached. But in 1960, almost exactly halfway through weightlifting recorded history, Yuri Vlasov broke the 200 kilos for the very first time. Very shortly after Vlasov won though, Anderson is rumored to have shown up in the backrooms, loaded the same weight as Vlasov winning lift, and clean jerked it multiple times with little to no rest to show the world that, had he competed, he would have won. But he didn't. Vlasov was the 1960 Olympic champion. And from there on, he kept improving. 1 year later, he managed 205 kilos, then 206, then 208, then 210. In one short year, he had already added 10 kilos to the legendary 200 kilo mark. And he'll keep on improving bit by bit. By 1963, he had managed to get the record all the way up to 212.5 kilos. But as you might have realized by now, no one can stay at the top forever. And in 1964, on the year of the Tokyo Olympics, Leonid Jabotinsky will take the record from Vlasov with a 213 kilo clean jerk. Jabotinsky and Vlasov were polar opposites, physique-wise. And now might be a good time to mention two types of lift that historically have been able to break the all-time world records in weightlifting. Let's call them the true super heavyweights and the light super heavyweights. The true supers took full advantage of the unlimited weight allowed by their category. They would bulk to massive weights, often in the 150 to 160 kilo range, way over 300 pounds. From the lifters already mentioned, you could find Paul Anderson or Leonid Jabotinsky in this category. The light supers, though, will be more moderate with their body weight. They are usually taller and often come from a weight-restricted weight class that they grew out of. These guys would try to maximize their muscle mass while limiting body fat and keeping a pretty aesthetic physique. From the lifters already mentioned, Chemansky and Vlasov would fit in the light super category. And so, come the 1964 Olympics, 160 kilos Jabotinsky who would face the defending champion, a 130 kilos, Vlasov. After having his record taken away, Vlasov came back just a few months before the game to clean and jerk a new personal record, but most importantly, a new world record. He will clean and jerk 215.5 kilos, 2.5 kilos or a Zabotinsky record. And at the Olympics, Vlasov was a pretty heavy favorite. He held every single world records and was the defending champion. And yet, in 1964, Vlasov and Zabotinsky will fight hard for the win. And with his very last lift, a 217.5 kilos world record, Zabotinsky will edge Vlasov by 2.5 kilos in the total and take home the Olympic gold. Vlasov's reign was over. He will never break another clean and jerk world record again. Now, for Zabotinsky, it's another story. He had finally taken a hold of the record, and he knew he could keep it for a while. And so for the next 4 years, all the way until the next Olympics, he will win every single competition he takes part in, and bring the record all the way up to 220 kilos, half a kilo by half a kilo. By the time of the Olympics, Zabotinsky was the undisputed king of the super heavyweights. And yet, just a few months before the Olympics, a young American just out of the heavyweight ranks will do something truly special. In 1968, at US Nationals, Bob Bernatsky will clean 220.5 kilos, the last American all-time clean and jerk world record ever. This might be one of the craziest entries in the super heavyweight clean and jerk record book ever. Bernatsky wasn't really a super heavyweight. In 1966, he competed internationally for the first time as a super heavyweight in the over 90 kilo category. He weighed 108 kilos. By 1968, he probably had gained some weight, but probably not that much considering that he competed in the new 110 kilo class just 1 year later. And so just like that, in 1968, a young American man weighing less than 120 kilos or 260 pounds had broken the record of the 160 kilos Soviet Olympic champion. Sadly for our story, Bob will place third at the US Olympic trials and won't make it to the Olympics. Zabotinsky took an easy win in New Mexico, but only managed the 202.5 kilo clean and jerk, which was enough for the win. The American record was safe, and it will actually stand for 2 more years. But in 1970, one man will load 221.5 kilos on the bar. And on this day, a legend was born. Vasily Alexeyev broke his very first world record. In 1970, Alexeyev is already 28 years old. It's not young at all, even for a super heavyweight. For a quick comparison, Bernatsky was only 24 years old when he managed to lift a world record in 1968. Alexeyev had taken weightlifting at 18 years old, and until 1968 he had been training with a coach. Although you might think the opposite, he was not naturally a big guy. All throughout his 20s, he pushed down food to gain weight, and most importantly, to gain strength. In 1968, he left his coach and became some kind of free agent, training on his own. So, a 28 years old man with no coaches, new to international competitions, breaking the all-time world record for the first time. At this point, it might have been hard to predict what Alexeyev would become, or how far he'd be able to push the records. But this will be answered fast. And as you might know, the answer was very, very, very far. In 1970, the clean and jerk world record will get into a frenzy, and will just keep getting higher and higher with no sign of it stopping anytime soon. This will mainly be thanks to Alexeyev, and at least at the start, thanks to another man, the only true rival of Alexeyev's life, Serge Redding. The Belgian man was a monster and a pretty known super heavyweight, on the contrary to Alexeyev. Redding was the bronze medalist of the 1968 Olympics, the European champion from 1969, a 2-time world silver medalist, and had earned his first major international medal all the way back in '64, some 6 years before the debut of the Russian. He had always been an exceptional lifter, but never quite a world record contender. And yet, just 3 short months after Alexeyev's record, Redding will load 222 kilos and get his very first clean jerk world record. This was a pivotal moment in Alexeyev's career. He was the newcomer and he had found a rival. 6 days, yeah, you heard well, 6 days after Redding record-breaking clean jerk, the Russian will take the stage and add on 1.5 kilos with 223.5 kilo clean jerk. 2 months later, he will add 2 more kilos onto the record. 3 months away from world, Alexeyev was in the lead. But then, once again, just 1 month later, Redding will take back the record with 226.5 kilos. And just like that, 2 months away from world, the record was 300 grams away from a new milestone, the 500 pounds mark. While weightlifting is a kilogram sport, the 100-pound milestones were always known and recognized by athletes from all countries. And the last milestone, as you know, had been broken a long time ago. The 400 pounds barrier had been broken 41 years earlier by our good old Frenchman Rigolo, unofficially. Because at this point, with the Soviets absolutely dominating the sport, another mark might have been on the mind of the teams. 17 earlier, an American, Chemansky, was the first man to break the 400 pounds barrier officially. So, with the World Championships taking place in Columbus, Ohio, the Soviets would have a solid shot at asserting their dominance over the Americans with their very own 100 pounds milestone, just 10 years after taking away the 200 kilo barrier from Anderson. Only one man stood in their way: Redding. Come competition day, Redding will have a pretty good overall performance, and after a 215 kilo clean jerk, he was ready to take on the 500 pounds mark. But Alexeyev will come out first and make it. 501 pounds, 227.5 kilos. The Soviets had done it. Alexeyev had done it. Redding will then come out for 502 pounds, but miss it. The Belgian will never touch the clean jerk world record again. As a little consolation prize though, 1 year later, just after Alexeyev took on the 500 pounds clean and press record, Redding will manage his 502 pounds press. The record will be broken again, just minutes later, but once again, a story for another day. On his very first year as a Soviet international super heavyweight, Alexeyev had broken a dozen of world records and became the new face of weightlifting. But the war says he was just getting started. By December 1970, the world record stood at 229.5 kilos. In January of the same year, it was still held by Bernatsky at 220.5 kilos. To better understand the progression of the world record from there on, I need to mention a crucial element of the Soviet sports system. I mentioned earlier that during the Cold War, governments started to inject more and more money into their sports programs. Well, a part of this money was used in the form of rewards to the top athletes of the country. Medalists, champions, and any top performing athletes would be rewarded as a reason for them to keep winning. The most important bonus, especially for Alexeyev, was the world record cash bonus. Every single time a world record was broken, he was getting paid. And so, instead of putting up the massive list that he could have put out of the blue, he decided to follow a bit of a different strategy. He would take the smallest possible improvements that he could on the world records and do it as often as he could. This being said, from September 1970 to November 1975, Alexeyev will break the record 25 times. He will win every single competition he'll take part in and get the record from 227.5 kilos to 246 kilos all by himself. But in 1975, after 5 years of absolute unseen domination, challengers will start to appear, as they always do. With Alexeyev having broken all possible limits, the rest of the field started to progress almost as fast as the Russian. And sure enough, the streak will be broken. Before we get to that though, I want to mention one specific attempt made during the 1975 World Championships. At this time, Alexeyev's record was set at 245 kilos. and he was ready to break it again with a half-kilo jump. But for the first and last time in history, an attempt at the all-time best clean jerk was made, not in the super heavyweight class, but in the heavyweight one. In the late 60s, a new coach had just taken charge of the Bulgarian Weightlifting Federation. You might be familiar with his name. Ivan Abadjiev. All the way back in 1957, he became the first man to win a weightlifting medal for the country of Bulgaria. And from the late 60s onward, he will become the brain behind every single other Bulgarian medal earned. And in 1975, one of his top athlete names was Valentin Histov. He was the top lifter of the heavyweight class in the 70s. And at Worlds in 1975, he marked history forever. After setting a new heavyweight record of 237.5 kilos, Hristov loaded 245.5 kilos on the bar. I'll just remind you now that the all-time best clean jerk at this point was 245 kilos, held by Alexeyev. Sadly, he'll miss the clean despite looking strong enough to make it. This was the only and the last time in modern history that a non-super heavyweight gave a shot at the all-time best clean jerk in competition. Back to Alexeyev then. Still in 1975 and still at Worlds, Alexeyev will manage his 245.5 kilos. 2 months later, he'll even bring it up to 246 kilos. But exactly 18 days later, for the first time in over 5 years, he will lose his record. Gerd Bonk will load 246.5 kilos and make it. The record wasn't Soviet anymore, and a new challenger had risen. As you would expect, just 10 days later, Alexeyev will break the record again and manage 247.5 kilos. But Bonk just had a taste of the all-time world record, and he was ready for more, for much more. We were getting close to what seemed like one of the last humanly possible barrier to break in the clean jerk, 250 kilos. We are now approaching a level that would place any super heavyweights that we'll mention from now on almost any podium in any competition ever. Actually, any lift north of 250 kilos would have been in the top 3 heaviest lift of every Olympic Games since 2004. And in 1976, the man that would break this mark would enter the legend and become, undoubtedly, one of the best clean jerker ever. In April of 1976, a shot was taken at the record. But it wasn't 250 kilos. It was 252.5 kilos. One of the biggest improvements on the world record. And for once, the Soviets weren't the ones to break the historic mark. Gerd Bonk had just destroyed the world record of the greatest super heavyweight in the world and maybe in history. But Alexeyev was not quite done yet. He wasn't the one to have broken the 250 kilo mark after bringing the record from 227.5 kilos to 246.5 kilos all by himself. And he was a bit sour about it. And it just happened to be the Olympic year. So in 1976, in Montreal, Canada, Alexeyev will clean jerk 255 kilos and become a 2 times Olympic champion. This remains to this day as one of the most legendary lifts ever made and will stand as the heaviest lift ever made in an Olympic game for the next 20 years. At this point, Alexeyev was 34 years old and he didn't have much more to give to weightlifting. Still, he will improve on his 255 kilo twice. In 1977, he will set his very last clean and jerk world record, 256 kilos. In 1970, when he took over the record for the first time, he lifted 221.5 kilos. In 1977, on his last rodeo, he lifted 34.5 kilos more. It is pretty safe to say that in the grand scheme of weightlifting history, Alexeyev is the most important lifter to set a foot on the platform. No one rivaled with him, and it's pretty hard to imagine the record getting this high, this fast, without him. For a few years after the 256 kilo clean jerk, it almost seemed as if weightlifting records went as high as they could get, and maybe, just maybe, Alexeyev's marks would stand forever. In 1980, Alexeyev will bomb out at the Olympic and fail to make any lift. He will retire from the sport after this competition. But less than a year later, a new lifter rose to the occasion. 4 years after Alexiev's last record, Vladimir Marchuk cleaned 257.5 kilos. The world record was not quite done yet. At this point, the field of super heavyweight in the Soviet team was as deep as it gets. Winning the Soviet championships was probably tougher than winning Worlds or Europeans, and only the top 2 or 3 lifters were ever flying out to international competitions. Marchuk wasn't one of them. His clean and jerk was the best of all time basically, but his snatch was too low, meaning that he always placed outside of the top 3 when considering the Olympic total. And so Marchuk never made it out of the USSR championships. Still, this record was extremely significant. Alexiev was beaten and the race for the world record just restarted. The year is 1981. Marchuk is now the world record holder, but he is not the best weightlifter of the Soviet Union. Another guy, almost 50 kilos lighter than him, bested him in the total. And on the very same year as Marchuk world record setting competition, a new contender will step on stage. He will be the last one to truly redefine the clean and jerk. In 1981, at 23 years old, Anatoly Pisarenko will step on the world stage for the very first time. Pisarenko's career story is short, extremely short even, and yet it might be one of the most important ones in the sport's history. Few know that, but he actually started out as a heavyweight. In 1979, aged 21 years old, he competed at his very first USSR championships and finished 5th with a 395 kilo total at 110 kilos of body weight. Just a year later, he had gained some weight and moved on to the super heavyweight class. But he was still lighter than any other super heavyweight of the team by an insane margin. Alexiev, on his last run for the Olympics, Marchuk and Rachmanov, the 1980 Olympic champion, were all in the 150 to 160 kilos range. In 1980, on the Olympic year, Pisarenko weighed less than 120 kilos. And yet his training went well, much better than the ones of every other member of the team. But he was too young and too light to the taste of the national team. And so his international debut will not happen at the 1980 Olympics. Actually, he will have to wait until the following year, in 1981. After well over a decade of true supers leading the sport and driving it to never achieved height, the Ukrainian looked out of place. And yet, on his very first major international competition, he crushed every other lifters. He won with a 237.5 kilo clean and jerk. But with one attempt left, he loaded 258 kilos for a new world record. And he missed it. But the message was passed on. Just 2 weeks after breaking the snatch and total world record, Pisarenko was already prepared to attempt the clean and jerk. This moment will also define the kind of lifter that Pisarenko was. An all-time best clean and jerk is something to be taken seriously. And it's not usually something you attempt if you're not certain that you can make it. But Pisarenko's approach was slightly different. In interviews, year after the end of his career, he discussed his goal to clean and jerk all the way up to 280 kilos before he turned 30 years old. These attempts, rather than what most elite weightlifters considered as the end goal, Pisarenko considered them as stepping stones to much, much bigger lifts. And so he missed a lot. World record clean and jerk attempts, then he'll succeed. In 1982, almost exactly 1 year after Marchuk's world record, Pisarenko stepped on stage again. And this time he'll manage. With a 258 kilo clean and jerk, he had just earned himself his very first world record. He'll improve on it again 2 months later with a 258.5 kilo clean and jerk. The 260 kilo mark was getting closer and closer. So, come to the 1982 World Championships, he had to give it a shot. Just like the year prior, he won the total on his second attempt. And on his third, he loaded the world record. But it was different. It was a big one. The world record, his own, stood at 258.5 kilos. But Pisarenko wanted the total world record. the addition of his snatch and his clean jerk. It was standing at 457.5 kilos, which he owned, by the way. And with a 197.5 kilo snatch, to break this record, he needed 262.5 kilos, a 4 kilo world record. So that's what he took. This is pretty much the fastest this kind of weight had ever moved, and in my opinion, the fastest it had moved since then. But once again, he fell forward, as for most of his failed attempts. Back in the 80s, contrary to nowadays, every lifter could be allowed a fourth attempt to break a world record without it counting toward the total, just for the record books. But in 1982, due to a mix-up with the judges, Pisarenko will be denied his fourth. The 260 kilo clean jerk barrier would live to see another day. He did look good for it though, and that makes the next record in the list just a bit harder to swallow. Because in December of 1982, Vladimir Marchuk clean jerked 260 kilos. It was the second world record of his life, and it was also the last. On this day, Vladimir Marchuk broke the last 10 kilo barrier of the clean jerk world record. Today, some 42 years later, the 270 kilo barrier still stands. And yet, this milestone lift wasn't made by a superstar or even by a world or Olympic champion. Marchuk's biggest achievement career-wise was still a win at the 1980 Soviet Championship, fittingly against Pisarenko. This could be the topic of a whole other video, the Soviet super heavyweight team of the 1980s. The sheer number of incredible talents that would pretty much all place in the top of any world or European championships nowadays was staggering. It might have been the biggest talent pool of any weight category in any sport of history, and some random world records were set to happen here and there. You will be glad to know that another one is coming, just a bit later. But first, back to Pisarenko. As you might have realized this far in the video, guys that got a significant barrier taken away from them were usually coming back to break the record again as fast as they could, and Pisarenko wasn't an exception. Luckily, it just so happened that a little competition was happening in Allentown 3 short months after Marchuk's record breaker performance, the 1983 Allentown record maker. Most of the top lifters in the world attended the competition, Bulgarians and Soviets for the most part. Pisarenko opened at 245 kilos and, apart from a little struggle on the jerk recovery, managed it pretty easily, then moved to 260.5 kilos. He wasn't the first man to clean jerk 260 kilos, but he was the first man to exceed it, a pretty nice consolation prize. But as you'd expect from him at this point, he didn't stop there. He just had to give a show worth watching to the 2,500 spectators that showed up to the venue. So he loaded 265 kilos. And once again, he missed it forward. But the tone was set. Pisarenko's next world record would be 265 kilos. Back to the depth of the Soviet super heavyweight team now, with yet another young guy in his early 20s wanting to make a name for himself. Sergei Didik. He had never even competed at Soviet nationals this far, but showed up in fantastic shape for his first outing in 1983. He snatched 185 kilos and clean jerked 255 kilos, taking 5th in the total. Pisarenko equaled his clean jerk, and Kurlovich, another top Soviet that we'll talk about just a bit later, even managed 260 kilos. But as everyone left the stage, Didik asked for a 4th attempt. 261 kilos. Once again, Pisarenko's record was broken, while less significant, the fact that it had been beaten by a newcomer probably didn't feel so good. Heading into the 1983 World Championships, the Ukrainian was set on his goals. For the 3rd year in a row, he would show up with 2 goals, the win and the clean jerk world record. But this time, the win wouldn't come easy. Alexander Kurlovich was there, and he was ready for something special too. Both opened pretty light, but this time the win wouldn't come as easily. Alexander Kurlovich was there, and he was ready for something special too. Both opened pretty light, both at 245 kilos, and both making it pretty easily, despite Kurlovich getting lightheaded on his first and having to come back for a second. But then things started to get serious. Pisarenko loaded 260 kilos for 5 kilo world record total, but failed. The door was then opened for Krolovic, that loaded 262.5 kilos for clean jerk and total world record, but he also failed. So back to Pisarenko for his third, and once again he failed. Both men had attempts at a 7.5 kilo world record total and a 1.5 kilo world record clean jerk, but they both failed. The clean jerk world record was still unbroken, and after having been broken around twice a year since 1981, Didic will hold on to his record for 14 months. Not much will happen in the meantime. The Los Angeles Olympics were getting close, and it seemed like the best of place to break both the all-time world record and Alexeyev's long-standing Olympic record. But in 1984, politics will change weightlifting history forever. In 1980, the Olympics were held in Moscow, and in the middle of the Cold War, the United States decided to boycott the Games. Only problem, the following Olympics were set to take place in Los Angeles. And so, as to answer to the boycott of the Moscow Olympics, the Eastern Bloc skipped the LA Olympics. Neither Pisarenko nor Krolovic will get their shot at an Olympic gold. Still, the Soviets knew that their team were ready for some of the greatest results in sports history. And in 1984, on the Olympic year, they proved it. To avoid a whole 4-year cycle of training from all of their athletes, the Soviet bloc organized a replacement competition, the 1984 Friendship Games in Varna. There, almost every single record in the sport of weightlifting was broken. But as you might expect, one in particular will stand out. In Varna, after a long year of wait, the world of weightlifting will finally see the all-time clean jerk record fall. And it fell in the most thrilling, incredible way a record ever fell. At the Friendship Games, Pisarenko and Krolovic were set to face in what appeared to be the greatest rivalry the sport had ever seen. The two strongest men to ever live, facing off in a duel for the ages. To understand the clean jerk portion of this competition, we'll first need to talk briefly about the snatch. Pisarenko opened relatively heavy at 200 kilos. He missed it twice, then made it. Krolovic opened at the same weight, but made it, and ended up with a 210 kilo snatch on his third attempt. Krolovic had a 10 kilo lead over Pisarenko going into a clean jerk, meaning that Pisarenko would need a big lift, and he knew it. So he opened at 245 kilos, made it, and secured the silver. And then he waited. Krolovic opened too, also at 245 kilos, then took conservative jumps. He ended up with a 252.5 kilo clean jerk and a 462.5 kilo total. Pisarenko still had 2 lifts remaining, but he would need to clean jerk 265 kilos to win, 4 kilos over the standing world record, 4 kilos over what any other man had ever lifted overhead. But, as Pisarenko had always done, he walked onto the platform with no doubt on his mind. He was going to do it. And sure enough, he made it. This is, to this day, the second best clean jerk ever made when accounting bodyweight. He is the only super heavyweight in the top 10 of this list. The video quality of this lift is mediocre at best. The clean footage of this competition exists somewhere though, and I'm hopeful that we might find it someday. As far as everyone knows, this is where the competition ended. But Pisarenko still had 1 lift left. And as we've discussed, the Ukrainian wasn't one to skip an attempt. So he went up. I had the chance to talk to the person that uploaded the original footage of this 265 kilo clean jerk on YouTube. And according to him, Anatoly Pisarenko loaded 270 kilos and cleaned it. But he failed the jerk, and so that was it. The following year, Pisarenko will fly to Canada to attend the Super Heavyweight Invitational competition. There, along with Krolovic, he will be caught with a suitcase full of performance-enhancing drugs. The two men weren't caught actually using the drugs though, so they technically didn't break any of the rules of the International Federation. But they were charged with international drug smuggling accusations in Canada, a pretty serious allegation that didn't make the Soviet Federation exactly happy. Both the Ukrainian and the Belarusian received a multiple-year-long ban, and for Pisarenko, that was it. He had competed for the first time in 1981. 4 short years later, he left the sport. He drove the clean jerk world record almost 7 kilos higher and broke the very last 5 kilo barrier the clean jerk record would ever see. Luckily for us, though, the story isn't exactly done yet. See, while Pisarenko didn't push through and come back to competition after his ban, Krlovic did. He wasn't allowed to join by the national team as soon as his ban ended, though, as the federation seemed to be holding quite a grudge. And so he started training back on his own for a while. He took things pretty slow at first, but by 1987, he was 100% back. He was ready for his first competition in years, the Soviet National Championships. But while he was gone, someone had risen above the rest, and once again he'd have to fight with all he got to take the win and the records, because a new king was in town. Leonid Tarnenko. Tarnenko was more than a seasoned lifter. Actually, at this point, he was the best heavyweight lifter of all time, period. He was the 1980 Olympic champion, the 1984 Friendship Games champion, a multiple world record holder, and the first non-super heavyweight to ever break the 200 kilo snatch barrier. But in 1986, following a pretty bad injury, he decided to take a chance and moved up to the super heavyweight class. It didn't work out so well for him results-wise. In 1987, he was yet to beat his best total as a heavyweight, while multiple dozens of kilos heavier. But he had already medaled twice internationally as a super heavyweight, and with Pisarenko and Krlovic out for a while, he started to appear as the best lifter of the country. And so, come the 1987 nationals, he had to stand his ground. Krlovic was back, and with the Olympics just 1 short year away, it was his chance to become the #1 favorite for the title. And these national championships were quite literally the best in the history of the super heavyweight category. Never had any country owned 2 lifters of such calibers at the same time. Both lifters will total 470 kilos, 5 kilos over the total world record and over Pisarenko winning total of the Friendship Games 4 years earlier. But most importantly, with a 262.5 kilo clean jerk, it is Tarnenko that will come out on top. Just a few months away from the World Championships, the now 3-year-old clean jerk world record had never been this close to falling. The 1987 Super Heavyweight World Championships were special. They might deserve a video all of itself, as every single record will be broken there by 3 different lifters. But we'll focus on the clean jerk. The first lift of interest for us would be the second attempt of Krlovic. After securing an easy win with 247.5 kilos, Krlovic came out for his second attempt, 260 kilos. This would be the heaviest lift of his life if he made it. And sure enough, he did, looking in the gold total and the all-time heaviest total on the way. But then, Tarnenko came out. He did not do good in the snatch and was in no way going to be able to contend from the gold total. But after his 262.5 kilo clean jerk at nationals, he was ready to break the all-time world record. And so 265.5 kilos were loaded on the bar. Tarnenko for history. He did it. He had become the man to break Pisarenko's legendary record. He celebrated, but it was not over. Krlovic had 1 attempt left. After failing to break the all-time world record 4 years earlier, he loaded 266 kilos. And he made it, or so it seems to the untrained eye. This was actually a no-lift, meaning that the jury gave it 3 red lights and that despite being put overhead with straight arms and stabilizing it, it was not validated. This was also Krlovic's last attempt at an all-time world record clean jerk. But this competition gave what people were expecting from it, a new clean and jerk world record holder. And Taranenko, this man, was here to stay in the record books for a long, long time, longer than anyone could have probably expected. The new world record was 265.5 kilos, and the new king was not quite done yet. In a way, he was very similar to Pisarenko. He knew that he wanted to drive this record up, and just like Pisarenko, he'll fail more all-time world record than he'll manage. The next attempt came just a few months after his first record, and it was a big one, actually the biggest one we got on camera. On the same year, another European competition will take place, the 1987 European Gala. 3 teams competed, Hungary, Bulgaria, and the Soviet Union. This was a very small and minor competition, but Taranenko was there, and as we know, he was on a quest to break his own record. He started at 245 kilos, made it pretty easily as you'd expect, then jumped 21 kilos, from 245 to 266 kilos, and he was following himself, meaning that he only got 2 minutes of rest in between his attempts. Not very optimal. But still, he came out pretty casually and gave it his best shot. That probably wasn't exactly what you expected. It didn't really look close. And yet, for some reason, he apparently felt like he had more in him. So he added 4 more kilos for 270 kilo clean jerk attempt. And let's see how it went.
Nem is tudom így első hallásra, melyik az elrémisztőbb szám. A 270 vagy a 475 kilogramm, ami az összetettben lehet. Hát maradjunk a 270-nél, az a látható valóság.
Yeah, I'm sure you did expect this one. 1987 ended with this competition, and Taranenko, with an international personal best of 242.5 kilos made 3 years earlier as a heavyweight, had attempted to lift more than any other human being ever 3 times. On to 1988. At the Europeans in Cardiff, Taranenko will take home an easy win. On his last attempt, he'll just give a shot at the clean and jerk world record again. But this time, it wasn't 266 kilos. It was 267.5 kilos. Go big or go home. This is as close as you could get from making a lift. And this is, to this day, the heaviest clean ever made on a competition platform that we got a video of. Until we end up finding the lost footage of Pisarenko alleged 270 kilo clean, which is bound to happen at some point. At this point, the battle of the 1988 Olympics in Seoul, opposing Taranenko to Krlovic, promised to be something incredible. And yet, it wasn't. Taranenko was not allowed to compete in the Olympics for some kind of obscure reasons. Officially, he was sick. Unofficially, he was in great shape just before and just after the Olympics. Either way, Krlovic was a clear favorite going into these games, but he won't lift anything special at all. He will only clean jerk 250 kilos, one of the weakest lifts of his career, but way enough to win, which is all that mattered really. Still, there are 2 lifts in particular that happened in 1988 that I would like to mention. The first one is a 265 kilos attempt by Manfred Nerlinger. Nerlinger had been a top super heavyweight for the last squad, and he remained just that for much of the following decade. But in 1988, he did a gutsy thing. He was outsnatched by 22.5 kilos and had no chances whatsoever to win. So he opened the clean and jerk at 240 kilos to secure himself a silver. And then, when everyone was done, he asked for 266 kilos. A 26 kilo jump, a 9 kilo personal best, and an all-time world record attempt from a man that had never even been a remotely credible contender for the world record. And yet, I'll let you see what his attempts look like. Glorious. This man doesn't quite get the recognition that he deserves, but I think he should. Now, for the second lift of this competition that I'd like to mention. But before we get on to that, I'd like to introduce to you the Sinclair system. Weightlifting is a weight class sport, and although we almost only discussed the non-restricted weight classes, it is important to keep in mind that the absolute strongest is rarely the absolute best weightlifter. So to solve this eternal question of who's the best weightlifter, we use the Sinclair coefficient. Taking into account a theoretical maximum and minimum body weight of a weightlifter, we come up with a formula that we'll be able to use to compare the performance of every lifter to the performance that the theoretically highest bodyweight lifter would be able to put out. To make this a little bit more understandable, let's imagine that a lifter manages a 200 kilo clean jerk at 100 kilo of body weight. According to the Sinclair coefficient, this is equivalent to the heaviest super heavyweight clean jerking 200 kilos, and so their Sinclair coefficient would be 220 Sinclair points. Now, despite focusing only on the absolute heaviest clean jerk records in this video, I find it relevant to also at least mention the top 3 theoretically best clean jerks of all time. One of them was already mentioned. In 1984, Anatoly Pezorenko clean jerks 265 kilos at a body weight of 127 kilos. This places him as the second best clean jerker of all time, all weight classes included. In third place, we'll find Alexander Varbanov, a 75 kilo lifter from Bulgaria that managed a 215.5 kilo clean jerk in 1987. This is 11.5 kilos over the current 73 kilo clean jerk world record. But, back to Seoul. In 1988, a 60 kilo man set the best Sinclair clean jerk of all time, and I think almost all of you know his name. Naim Suleymanoglu, the Pocket Hercules. He clean jerked 190 kilos at 60 kilos, 10 kilos over triple body weights. He is also the leader of the total Sinclair leaderboard, and is the best weightlifter to ever live. This video just wouldn't have felt right without mentioning him, so now that we got that out of the way, back to our big guys. As I told you earlier, the reasons of Taranenko absence from the 88 Olympics were fishy. And so, a few months after the game, when heading to the Super Heavyweight Invitationals in Australia, the world record holder was in shape. And it might just have been a coincidence, but it so happened that Kofa, in charge of the organization of the competition, had managed to get a big sponsor, Samboy Chips. It isn't the sexiest sponsor, but it entered some money in the possible cash prize. And so, in a car ride with Krlovic, 88 super heavyweight Olympic champion, Zakharevich, 88 heavyweight Olympic champion, and Taranenko, world record holder, Kofa got an idea. He proposed a big cash prize to any of these three were they to break an all-time world record. Neither Krlovic nor Zakharevich were in any shape to even think of attempting it. But Taranenko was, and so he asked how much for 2 world records, and Kofa answered double. So that was it. One day before what should have been a very casual competition, Taranenko will set his mind on the clean jerk and total world record. He'll stop talking and start to get in his head. And come competition day, here's what he did.
Psyching up, gathering the strength within that's going to be necessary to lift this phenomenal amount of weight. Ooh. Here he goes. Taranenko pulls 586.25 pounds. Looking determined. If he makes it, Taranenko set weightlifting history in Canberra. 586.25 pounds directly overhead. The lift is good. Coach Medvedev obviously pleased with Taranenko's performance, setting 2 world records.
Out of nowhere, Leonid Taranenko had broken his own clean jerk world record and the total world record while he was at it. Kofa will run to him after the 266 kilo record and propose to double the money for 270 kilo world record attempt. Taranenko will accept, but the clock will run out before the change could be registered by the competition officials. A new world record was set at the Samboy Chips Cup. Surely this wouldn't stand long. Ternenko seemed in shape, and so did Krlovic and Nerlinger that attempted the same weight twice this year. And yet, this record stood 32 years, 11 months, and 21 days. Yeah, not exactly what you'd expect. There are a few good reasons for that though. In between this record and the next, the weight classes changed 3 times. Every time the weight classes were changed, all previous world records were erased. This meant that every lifters, including in the super heavyweight class, despite its change being almost purely cosmetic with one number changing at the end, would now aim to break the new world records, all set much lower than the all-time world records. Another reason, maybe just as important, if not more, is the fact that drug testing protocols greatly improved over the years. I chose to avoid the topic of performance-enhancing drugs this far in the video, although I will mention that the Russian weightlifting team allegedly started to use PEDs in 1954, shortly followed by the United States and by every other countries. Feel free to go back in the video to see the changes in speed of improvement of the world record from this period onward. It is undeniable that a stricter testing regimen submitted to all athletes would result in slower and slower improvements of the world records. With this out of the way, let's get over to the most significant moments of this dead space in the world record history and discuss some of the men that might have been able to break the records if they were to attempt it. Our first stop will be 1996, 8 years after Ternenko world record. A Russian, the biggest weightlifter we'd ever seen, Andrei Shamerkin, will become the first man to break 260 kilos in the 1990s. This lift also happened to be an all-time Olympic record, beating Alexeyev's world record set 20 years earlier. It seems crazy as this 255 kilo record was beaten by multiple lifters in the early 80s, but it just happened that the Olympics in the super heavyweight ranks were kind of boring, rarely approaching the levels of competitions of Worlds and European Championships. 1 year later, Shamerkin will clean jerk 262.5 kilos for what will stand as the heaviest lift of the 1993-1997 weight class. Next stop, and it's an important one, is the 2000 Olympics super heavyweight session. I know I just said the super heavyweight Olympics were boring, but there are a few exceptions, and this is the biggest of them. This was, simply put, the heaviest weightlifting competition of all time, and it's not close. At this point, it might seem like I keep saying such things as the best session, the best competition and such, but this is mainly because the only competitions worth mentioning in this video are the most exceptional ones of all time. But this one really is, by every metric possible, the craziest super heavyweight competition ever. The snatch portion was crazy in itself, but we'll have to skip it, so let's jump straight into the clean jerk. In 2000, 6 men attempted 260 kilos or more, for 8 total attempts, with the 3 best clean jerk of the session being tied at 260 kilos. This is something that had never been seen and that will never be seen again. The only recorded time when 3 men clean jerked 260 kilos in the same competition was never. Not even at Soviet nationals, in the peak days of their team. And they surely never were 8 attempts at 260 kilos or more in one competition. Let's just get a quick rundown of the most important attempts of the session. Yaber Said Salem at 123 kilos will attempt 260 kilos to break in the top 3 and miss. Ashot Danielan will attempt 262.5 kilos for the silver and miss. Ronnie Weller will attempt 262.5 kilos too for the win and miss. Hossein Rezazadeh will attempt 260 kilos for the win and make it. But then it gets crazy. Kim Tae-yeon, having already done 260 kilos, will attempt 265 kilos for a 2.5 kilo world record and miss. And then it gets crazier. Andrei Shamerkin, defending Olympic champion, put what he needs to win on the bar.
And now they're on their feet here because this is the last lift of the night. Andrei Chemerkin of Russia trying to go through the roof at 272.5 kilos. 600 pounds. This is like trying to kick a 75-yard field goal.
Anybody can do it. Chemerkin can. He's a great pressure lifter.
He won on his last lift in Atlanta with a world record. Are we going to see that all over again? No.
This was the heaviest attempt of all time. Chemerkin pulled it high enough to get under, but his very poor mobility didn't allow him to rack it. The 2000 Olympics ended with these lifts, and the new king of the super heavyweight was crowned. Hossein Rezazadeh from Iran. Rezazadeh was considered by many as the strongest super heavyweight, maybe ever, but he was never pushed even a little bit. After his first international title in 2000, he will just remain unbeaten, unchallenged. He was simply too good for his era. Had the record been 266 kilos and not 262.5 kilos, there is very little doubt that he would have at least given it a shot. But he didn't. And so we'll have to satisfy ourselves with a new world record of 263.5 kilos set in Athens at the Olympics, and with a 265 kilo recorded clean jerk made at Iranian Nationals. Hossein will retire early and leave the top spot of the category open. Before we move on from the reign of Rezazadeh though, one lift stood out in this period, and it wasn't attempted by the Iranian. In 2001, Jaber Said Salem, born Bulgarian and transferred to Qatar in the late 90s, will compete at Worlds and secure an easy win over a pretty weak competition. But what will interest us here is his last attempt. After managing a pretty easy 250 kilo clean jerk, Jaber will load the new world record, 263 kilo. The only thing is he was 125 kilos of body weight, and had he made this lift, he would have climbed on the third spot of the best clean jerk ever by Sinclair, and the second best super heavyweight clean jerk ever by Sinclair, just behind Pisarenko. He'll miss the jerk, according to him mainly due to a too big jump in weight between his second and third attempt. Let's move on now. Come the 2008 Olympics, the overall level of the competition wasn't quite the best. But still, as we're getting to the end of our story, I'd like to mention a last lifter that might have not moved any records, but that have moved the sport, maybe more than any other lifters mentioned so far. At the Beijing Olympics, Matthias Steiner, an Austrian-born German weightlifter, is set to compete in the Olympics, facing the best super heavyweights in the world, all better than him on paper. He is not a favorite. But sometime before the competition, Matthias lost his wife. Before she passed though, he made her a promise. Come the Olympics, he'd win the gold medal. And sure enough, come competition day, he does good. Maybe better than what anyone would have expected, but not quite good enough. With every lifter done with their competition, Matthias stands second, with a single attempt remaining. He is 9 kilo behind the first place. His best clean jerk ever this far in his life was 246 kilos. He had already surpassed that by 2 kilos in this very same competition, with a 248 kilo clean jerk. He would need 10 more kilos for the win.
Interessanten Lebensgeschichte steht da und konzentriert sich nur noch auf eines, nämlich auf dieses ungeheure Gewicht. Er kann jetzt Olympiasieger werden, aber dazu muss er das Ding erstmal sauber auf die Schultern legen und das ist schwer, oh ist das schwer. Matthias Steiner, heb das Ding hoch, einmal in deinem Leben, heb es hoch, heb es hoch, heb es hoch, das kann Gold sein, das kann sein, die Goldmedaille, es ist gültig, das ist Gold für Matthias Steiner.
With this 258 kilos clean jerk, Steiner didn't beat any record. And yet, he might be one of the most important person in weightlifting history. The following years were very calm. No big barrier was broken. No world record was challenged. But in the early 2010, training footage started to pop out here and there. And with this, we finally saw something new. Something that this far was more so a legend than anything else. 270 kilos overhead. We know that Pisarenko allegedly cleaned 270 kilos in competition, and that he almost certainly clean and jerked it in training. And despite not too many stories coming out, it's pretty easy to imagine that Krlovic, Taranenko or Rezazadeh would have done it in training too. A 270 kilo bar jerked overhead. In 2011 though, a Russian weightlifter turned professional strongman, Mikhail Koklyaev, will release the very first video of a 270 kilo jerk. Sure, it was from the rack, and sure, it was behind the neck. But still, this was a new barrier. Anyone could now just go on the internet and find a 270 kilo jerk. 2 years later, the very first front rack jerk was uploaded, made by Artem Utachin, a Ukrainian super heavyweight moderately successful internationally. Back to competition though. In 2015, a Russian weightlifter, quite irregular internationally this far, will show up to the World Weightlifting Championships. Before this competition, Alexei Lovchev had managed a 205 kilo snatch and a 257 kilo clean and jerk. This was very, very good, but he had only ever won one international competition and had bombed out at Worlds the previous year. Still, he was a heavy favorite. And sure enough, he delivered. He really, really delivered. He opened light at 242 kilos, then took 248 kilos for the win. And with one attempt remaining, he took 264 kilos to break Rezazadeh's 11 years old record, and maybe, more importantly, to tie the all-time best total world record of Taranenko set 27 years earlier. This lift was the greatest lift made since the last 80s. It is hard to oversell Lovchev's performance, as it was quite literally the greatest weightlift the world had seen in decades. The future seemed bright, and it looked like Lovchev was set to become the best weightlifter of all. But, as you've probably come to expect from the sport of weightlifting this far in the video, things don't always go as they should. Just a few weeks after the competition, Lovchev's drug tests come back positive. His record, erased. The gold will be awarded to the original silver medalist, a 23 years old Georgian super heavyweight, Lasha Talachadze. Lasha's dominance over the sport since then has been the most exceptional the sport has ever known. He crushed all of the records shortly after his first world title, won the Olympics in 2016, and Worlds and Europeans every single year since then. But interestingly enough, Lasha clean and jerk took a while to rise to a world record level. The main reason being his incredible snatch. By being by far the best snatcher in the world, he could just basically tie the silver medalists in a clean and jerk to win the competition, and rarely needed to break into the 260s to break the all-time world record total. And so, despite him breaking his very first world record in 2016 and his very first all-time world record in the snatch in 2017, Lasha won't clean and jerk 260 kilo in competition until 2019. At Europeans, he will make the first of the 5 260 kilos plus clean and jerk he'll ever make in his career. A few months later, he'll pull on 264 kilos to break his own world record and tie Lovchev's now unofficial world record. Then, in the lead up to the Tokyo Olympics, Lasha will release a video of the greatest clean and jerk ever made, 270 kilos. 40 years after when we could estimate the first 270 kilo training clean and jerk to be made, the world finally saw it. It was great, it was beautiful, but one thing remained. Taranenko's record was still standing, and Lasha knew it. In Tokyo, he'll break his own world record and become the third man to ever break the 265 kilos barrier. 4 months later, Lasha Talachadze will load 267 kilos on the bar. He'll make the clean, then make the jerk, standing on the shoulders of dozens of men, having pushed the records through dozens of barriers over 130 years. Lasha is the strongest man of all time. Thank you for watching.